Episode one of the long awaited Ken Burns' The American Revolution documentary premiered tonight on PBS, and I am here with the review, notes in hand. We're going to hit on some macro thoughts about episode one, as well as some of the minutiae of the episode and everything in between. So let's dive right in. Episode one was titled In Order to Be Free, dated May 1754 through May 1775. And with any Ken Burns documentary, I think the first episode is always the most important because it sets the scene of why what is to come takes place. So, other documentaries about the American Revolution, it could start in 1770 during the Boston Massacre, or 1775, at the battles of Lexington and Concord, or the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But Burns specifically begins this in 1754, so he can place the viewer in the 13 colonies at that time and show how the resentment of the American people builds up to what comes in the 1770s and 1780s. So I think that is just always beautifully done by Ken Burns because to most people they think this is a war fought between the 13 colonies and the British monarch. In reality, it's a war fought on hundreds of fronts. It's really the first global war. You have the natives on the Western Front, you have the French, you have Spanish occupation. And so really, I think the first hour 15 of the documentary, episode one specifically, sets the scene for what is going on in the colonies and why it eventually turns into a full-fledged revolution. But the first 30 seconds is an excerpt from Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. I think this is really important for a couple of reasons. I'm going to read the last sentence of the excerpt. Paine writes, he acquires a knowledge of his rights by attending justly to his interests and discovers in the event that the strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it, and that in order to be free, it is sufficient that he wills it. So I think this is important for multiple reasons. First is that I think Thomas Paine is one of the least talked about founding fathers while being one of the most impactful founding fathers. If you were living in the late 18th century in the colonies, you were very aware of who Thomas Paine was because of his pamphlets, Rights of Man, Common Sense. These were very widely passed around. They would be number one on the New York Times bestseller list if they had one back in the day. And everyone was not only aware of Paine, but they were influenced by him. And so I think for Burns to start, it's just very Burns-esque to start the whole six-part documentary with a quote from someone who's pretty underrated on a modern scale, but really impactful back in the late 18th century. You'd think he'd start with a quote from George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or even a John Adams, but Burns brings this quote from Paine, and I think it underscores how the American people felt, right before the brink of revolution. And it's just brilliant. I think it's brilliant, and what Burns does in episode one is brilliant by setting the scene at a larger scale. I think the maps are on point. You try to tell the story of something that happened 250 plus years ago, and it's really hard. There's no photos, there's no videos, so you have to rely on paintings. You have to rely on the oratory of historians, of journals, and of maps. And I think they did a terrific job with the map creation of this, specifically of the 13 colonies. They also had some wonderful maps of the Atlantic, kind of showing the position with Britain compared to the world as a whole in their conquests in the Caribbean. I think that's important as well. Britain saw Americans saw themselves as one of 13 colonies. Britain saw America as 13 of their 30 plus colonies until, the 13 colonies really started making noise. I also think the more micro maps, such as those of the battles of Lexington and Concord, are really important for viewers because they can kind of put themselves in position of what's going on. You can see how the British troops, rode their way across the river, marched their way to Lexington on their way to Concord, and then, met up at that North Bridge with the militia of the Americans. So I just think the visuals were tremendous, and that's where a lot of documentaries covering these topics from hundreds of years ago go wrong, is they don't have the visuals that keep you hooked. Burns has no problem with that. He's been around the block a few times. He knows how to do this. That's why there's a Ken Burns effect on every single editing software. So, bravo once again, done really well. As I mentioned, he hit on the fact that the war was fought on hundreds of fronts. Specifically, like I said, it was more of a global war than we truly do realize. I also think that the first 75 minutes of episode one are really important because they build up to why the revolution did end up happening, how the American people started to grow resentment towards the monarch. Whether it was from this pressure from the British military and the British Navy, specifically up in New England, whether it was the taxes, the Stamp Act, things of that nature. And you were able to kind of position yourself and grow with the American people throughout the episode. It starts off where, it might not be bad living in the 13 colonies under British rule. And then you see why resentment slowly and slowly builds. The first marquee event slash skirmish that was touched on in episode one was the Boston Massacre of 1770. Basically, if you don't know, quick TLDR on that, five Bostonians were killed as a large group was heckling and throwing snowballs at British militia, and then gun shots rang and five Bostonians died. But what I think is really important about this and what I learned was that upon the burial of those five killed, 10,000 people showed up. And what's interesting is in 1770, Boston had 16,000 residents, which means over half of the residents showed up. So I think this kind of underscores the unity that Boston and Massachusetts kind of had for the cause and for each other, which then permeates throughout the rest of the colonies as you progress through the episode and as we progress through the series. I think we're going to see that. But this was, 1770, and these Bostonians felt so strongly that these people were murdered in cold blood, and they were one of them, that they really showed out in droves for the burial. So I thought that was pretty important. The Boston Tea Party was the second major event touched on. It was the first time that private property was destroyed in a major way, kind of protesting the British. This was obviously protesting the tea tax. What I thought was really important and kind of a key detail that if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed. There was one person, everyone got on the boats and was dumping the tea. There was someone who was trying to, take tea for themselves, stuff it in their pockets, free tea. And that person got a strong beating, according to episode one, which again underscores the unity of the Bostonians and the people of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In we are anti the monarch. We are not here to just loot for ourselves. This cause is bigger than just you and me. This is for all of us. And so there are these little tidbits, which is why you have to pay so close attention to Ken Burns' pieces, because he drops in these little tidbits that almost connect like a map throughout, which are really important. But after the Boston Tea Party, it was the first time that the people of the Southern colonies kind of rallied around Massachusetts, specifically Virginia, who was a major player and was the major player of the Southern colonies at the time. And when, in response to the Boston Tea Party, the British monarch sent a load of troops, 10,000 plus, to Boston to kind of quell, essentially police the area and quell any rising tensions. And Virginia rallied around Massachusetts' right to protest in that way. And so this was kind of the first unifying bond that we saw between the southern and the northern colonies. So as I mentioned, the first 70, 80 minutes of episode one essentially set the stage for what we get at the end of episode one, as well as what we'll probably get in episodes 2 through 4, 2 through 5, in regards to the actual fighting. And so the end of episode one touches on the battles of Lexington and Concord, which is really the first official bloodshed of the war. And it talks about Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea, riding to alert the Massachusetts militia and the Minutemen, things of that nature. Almost 50 Americans die on this day, April 19th, 1775. Almost 100 of the British Army die. And so this is kind of the first, kickoff to like, oh, we are really fighting a war. And so up until this point, you had the Continental Congress, who had met one time previously in Philadelphia. They met again 3 weeks later after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And the first time that the Continental Congress met, not all 13 colonies showed up. The second time, all 13 colonies showed up. The first time, there was a pretty significant amount of pushback against the people of Massachusetts, against John Adams, against Samuel Adams, saying, hey, this doesn't have to be a full on revolution. We don't want to fight the monarchy. We don't want to fight the British. The second time they meet and they hear about what happened at Lexington and Concord, opinions start to change, opinions start to sway. And this is where the 13 colonies really become the 13 colonies on a united front. There's a quote from Patrick Henry of Virginia, late 1774. He said, I am not a Virginian, I am an American. I think this is crucial because, people in New England at the time viewed themselves mostly as Americans, obviously outside of the loyalists. But the people in the South, as shown in the documentary, they felt that they were still under British rule, and they were okay with it because those in the South had to deal more with Indians on the Western Front, and they saw the British as protectors for them and not really inhibitors to anything they wanted to do. So, episode one, as I mentioned, it set the scene. I also think it did a really good job of showing how those in New England and in the northern colonies connected themselves with those in the southern colonies, specifically Samuel Adams, created the committees of correspondence, which essentially was a branch off of the Continental Congress to show those in the southern colonies why there is a cause to be fighting for, why it is worth it to bear arms to fight against the British. And this is really important, as I mentioned earlier, because the war is not won without those in the southern colonies. Yeah, as you'll see in the episodes going forward, George Washington from Virginia, pretty big factor in winning the Revolutionary War. Kind of my final thought in something that was portrayed really well, it wasn't explicitly stated, but it's something that you can infer after watching episode one, is that Americans of the late 18th century were really good communicators. And I think this is critical for the success of the revolution because guys like Thomas Paine through pamphlets and newsletters, guys like John Adams and Samuel Adams through oratory and their writings, even, a Patrick Henry, a George Washington, a John Jay. They're all really good orators. A lot of them are lawyers by trade, but they're really good communicators. They're really good at getting others to rally for a common cause. I think this is really crucial because, like a good coach in a locker room, these people of the countryside, which at the time, most of the population of the 13 colonies, were farmers. Very few lived in the city hubs of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. So most of these people, didn't care as much about the British rule, but these terrific communicators were able to get across to them why it was so important to bear arms and fight for their freedom. And ultimately, that led to the amount of people, enrolling in the Continental Army. Really well worth it. Ken Burns does a terrific job of putting you in the time. A lot of documentaries on the Revolutionary War or, anything that doesn't have photos or videos, they become very boring. But what Burns does better than anyone else is he situates you in the time and he makes you feel what other people felt. One final point here, you want to hear from George Washington, you want to hear from Franklin and Jefferson and Adams and Jay and Henry. But what Burns does a terrific job of is also let you hear from the commoners, of the 14-year-old boy who walked 100 miles from Falmouth down to Boston to see if his family was still alive after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Like these more commoners who most people are commoners. Those are the stories you really want to know about and hear about because you can kind of realistically picture yourself in that situation. And I think that's what Burns does a really great job of. Something that he hit on well in the back half of episode one, and something I guarantee you will continue to see, especially through the years of battle and the battle journals that come of that from the Continental Army. So appreciate you sticking it out if you made it this far. Drop that subscribe button or hit the subscribe button. I think that's what you say on YouTube. Um, yeah. Catch you on episode 2. Deuces.